the longest peace negotiation in history. In the middle of July 1968, the Committee for Reunification invited comrades Nguyen Thi Tao, Lai Van Sao, Ngoc Dung, several others, and myself to a briefing on the party's directive for its new strategy. Attack on the battlefield and negotiate at the conference table. We understood that it was not yet the right time to resolve the issues between the United States and the National Liberation Front. Instead, we would undertake a new form of struggle. On the battlefield, we had to fight even more vigorously so the U.S. Saigon administration would realize that its cruelty could not overcome us and that the war had reached a decisive point. At the same time, the situation created the chance for us to open a widespread diplomatic front. We could help the world understand even more clearly the schemes and cruelty of the United States in Vietnam. We needed to highlight the U.S. intention to force its domination over our small, poor nation, which wanted only peace and freedom and which couldn't possibly hamper American interests. This new diplomatic front could enhance our influence on international and U.S. public opinion, isolate the forces of aggression, and provide effective support for the battlefield. Of course, we also believe that eventually the war would end and the two parties would sign a peace agreement at the negotiating table. After almost 6 years of diplomatic activities for the National Liberation Front, NLF, the Front, or the Viet Zone of South Vietnam, I had accumulated some knowledge and experience in diplomatic and political struggle. However, I never guessed I would have the good fortune to receive this challenging, complex, and important assignment to help represent my country at the historic negotiations in Paris with the goal of ending the war and restoring peace. Those negotiations, which may have been the longest in world history, began in November 1968 and ended on January 27, 1973, with diplomatic follow-up in Paris lasting until that June. When I left Hanoi at the end of October 1968, I never expected the negotiations to last so long. Before leaving, I phoned Kang at the Military Engineering School in Bac Giang Province and arranged to see him. I felt perplexed because I did not know how to tell my husband the news, and I did not know what to say to my children, who were too young to understand that I might be away for an indefinite time. Kang understood that I needed to undertake an important task. He didn't ask for specifics, but only encouraged me. "You have a mission you must fulfill," he said. "Leave for your assignment with peace of mind. The children have me and your father to care for them." I loved Kang even more dearly at that moment and was endlessly grateful to him. I left home with so many feelings, yet I constantly reminded myself that I must work to the limit of my strength to complete my responsibility. Our leaders had placed their confidence in me. I had to live up to that confidence. I took with me the principles of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, several documents with guidance for the struggle, and President Ho.S. valuable advice, which comrades at the Reunification Committee had reproduced. During the struggle, it was crucial always to hold to this central, underlying norm. Retain immutable principles during myriad changes. I think our two Vietnamese delegations from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam carried out these directives precisely. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Comrades Nguyen Thi Tao, Ben Tan, Phan Ba, Nguyen Van Khai, and I were the members of the first NLF delegation to depart for the preparatory meetings. We flew by way of Beijing and Moscow. We told everyone the reason for our trip was a mission to Cuba. At around 2 p.m. on November 2nd, 1968, we landed at Le Bourget Airport north of Paris, just as the weather in France was beginning to turn chilly. From the airplane, we could see crowds of people waiting to greet us. Such excitement, emotion, and joy. We encouraged each other to look dignified and smile. just as Comrade Nguyen Thi had gently reminded us. That day, I was wearing a dark pink Vietnamese áo dai, our traditional dress, over which I wore a gray coat and a flower-adorned black scarf. As soon as we entered the terminal, many journalists and photographers surrounded us. Even though hefty Vietnamese and French security guards escorted us. With all the jostling, I barely escaped, falling. Ben Tan, my secretary and official interpreter, and I stayed close together the entire time. Our mission was to state clearly the purpose and significance of the NLF delegation at the Paris conference. I tried to speak loudly, but with dignity. Ben Tan interpreted in such a clear and coherent style that many praised her, saying she spoke French extremely well, like a native French speaker. Many people crowded in to see, hear, and photograph the delegation. The chaos made it seem as if the furniture were splintering and the windows were cracking. We were taken to Villa Vevenet, the site that our comrades in the delegation from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRVN or North Vietnam, had arranged for us. We were startled to see the journalists and photographers following us. Some were climbing over the villa's walls, while others poked their cameras through slits in the gate to snap a few shots of the Viet Song. We had a good laugh and reassured each other, saying, "We came here to disseminate information about our front and affect public opinion. Why should we flinch from these journalists? On the contrary, we should welcome them." Of course, first we needed a meaningful plan. 2 days later, we held a large press conference with over 400 reporters from the international press. This was my first exposure to so many journalists. I spoke, presenting the front's legitimate position and our good while in seeking a peaceful solution. The journalists competed to ask their questions. I hid my worry and fear that I would say something to expose a weakness the journalists could exploit. Outwardly, I remained calm and poised. The articles the journalists wrote after that press conference were all sympathetic. No one picked holes. After all, a gentle, petite woman from a land where war raged had stood before them, speaking with reason and feeling. Indeed, our first steps had created sympathy among the press. During the following days, many journalists and television companies requested separate interviews. Some days, we even had several press sessions. The work was nerve-wracking, particularly with those TV lights shining in my face. The brothers and sisters in the delegation encouraged me, saying so. They're paying lots of attention to the NLF delegation. That's exactly what we wanted. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The four-party preparatory meetings began on November 6, 1968. But the United States pointed out that the representatives from the Saigon administration had not yet arrived. Another reason to delay was procedural, including the question of the shape of the negotiating table. World diplomatic history had never seen negotiations begin with an extended struggle over the negotiating table's shape. Although many people joke about that stage, there were important reasons for this extended discussion because the shape and seating arrangements at the main table symbolized the political and legal characteristics of the four sides. From May until October 1968, the discussions between Comrade Nguyen Thi, head of the DRVN delegation, and U.S. Ambassador Avril Harriman had been very heated about the role of the National Liberation Front. On our side, we made it clear that the front was the representative of the Southern people who opposed the United States. Thus, the NLF must be one of the negotiating parties. However, the United States held that the front was composed of people from the North, meaning communists, who wanted to overthrow the nationalists whom the United States supported in the South. We asserted in response that the United States had chosen and established the Saigon administration, which was therefore clearly composed of American hirelings. Thus, The struggle over whether the table would present 4 sides or 2 sides had important political significance. We requested a square table for its 4 equal sides or a round table divided into 4 equal sectors. The United States insisted on a rectangular table for 2 sides or a round table divided into 2. Here is a little-known detail. Comrade Nguyen Thi's delegation received many table designs from world-famous furniture companies. Ambassador Harriman's delegation probably received just as many brochures. In the end, Comrade Nguyen Thi and Ambassador Harriman reached unity, deciding on a large round table 8 meters in diameter and covered with a green cloth. Their plan divided the table into halves. The 4 sides had dividing lines, which were clearly defined by the reserve staff space behind each delegation. In this way, everyone could interpret the table's design as 2-sided or 4-sided, depending on his or her point of view. The delegations from the United States and the Saigon administration sat close together as if they were one. However, on our side, the front and the DRVN sat as 2 separate delegations. The seating arrangement was not advantageous for the Americans and the Saigon administration, since people could clearly see that the Saigon authorities were little more than lackeys of the Americans. Given that configuration, how could the Saigon administration claim to represent the people of the South? The preparatory meeting began on November 27, 1968. It was a simple meeting primarily to decide technical issues, such as the number of official participants and the order of presentations. The formal 4-sided conference did not begin until January 25th of the following year. Comrade Tran Bu Kim served as head of the NLF delegation, while Comrade Tran Hoai Nam and I served as deputy heads. Our having 2 delegations, the DRVN and the NLF, is a special case, unique in the history of international diplomatic relations. I believe I should speak clearly about this point. We presented our 2 delegations as representatives of one struggle under the unified leadership of the Vietnamese Workers' Party, now the Vietnamese Communist Party. In terms of foreign political presentation, we had established a unified position. Although 2, we are 1. Although 1, we are 2. The 2 delegations with 2 different populations, the NLF in the South and the DRVN in the North, reinforced each other as strength. As a result, our foreign affairs front was expansive and lively. We could contribute to victory in our shared struggle to oppose American aggression, seize independence, and reunite our country. We all know these historical truths. The Vietnamese Workers' Party and the DRVN government led our country's war of resistance against France. They seized a resounding Vietnamese victory at Dien Bien Phu and forced France to sign the Geneva Agreement in 1954. After that, France and other nations accepted Vietnam's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Nevertheless, the United States did not sign the joint statement at Geneva. Given the international conditions during the middle of 1954, we Vietnamese had to accept the temporary division of our country into 2 sectors, with reunification expected to follow a nationwide general election 2 years later. However, the ink on the agreements had not yet dried when the United States intervened in Vietnam, replacing France. The United States discarded the 1954 Geneva Agreement, adopted a scheme to keep our country divided for a long time, and intended to turn South Vietnam into a new American colony. On December 20th, 1960, after 4 years of intense but unsuccessful political struggle, the people of South Vietnam established the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, a movement uniting people from all strata of society. Our goal was to lift aloft the banner of continued struggle against the invaders and to demand independence and reunification of our country. The NLF announced its peaceful and neutral stand in a policy appropriate to the situation, emphasizing the aspirations of the people of the South and taking advantage of wide support from the peoples of the world. The Front's membership included a wide variety of people, among them progressive revolutionary forces, activists from religious, peace, and social groups, various political parties, and people who did not favor socialism and who even feared communists. For nearly 16 years, the NLF's blue and red flag with its 5-pointed gold star flew on 5 continents as a true symbol of the people's struggle in the South. At the 4-party conference in Paris, the NLF, as representative of the Southern people directly involved in the war, presented political solutions aimed at ending the war and restoring peace. We used flexibility, responding to every change in the armed struggle with initiatives to expand and clarify our goodwill, take advantage of public opinion, and push our opponents into increasing embarrassment. These were our diplomatic offensives. The DRVN, as representative of the people of the North, and as the rear guard for our military struggle in the South, consistently heightened the Front's role and supported every solution we presented. Even now, in my memory, I can still hear Comrade Swan Twee's composed, calm, self-possessed voice every time I announce a new initiative. I completely agree with Madam Ben. He would say, that was our external presence. However, internally, we closely coordinated the 2 delegations through one source of flexible, precise guidance, which came from inside our country. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The negotiations opening gambit about ceding forced the United States to recognize the existence of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. This marked an important early stage of the negotiations and a major U.S. defeat. The arguments at the conference table were lengthy, for the NLF and DRVN delegations openly and publicly criticized and denounced the United States. The American delegation would sidestep and push the Saigon delegation into long-winded responses. After 5 months of meetings on August 8, 1969, U.S. President Nixon announced his Vietnamization policy for the war. His idea, use Vietnamese to fight Vietnamese, caused international journalists to describe the policy as changing the color of the corpse's skin. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The French Kleber International Conference Center was located on Kleber Avenue, about 100 meters away from the Arc de Triomphe in the center of Paris, the capital of France. Although the building was not large, its architecture was majestic. A drawing room led to a large meeting hall surrounded by rooms for small meetings. The meeting hall had 2 main doors. The U.S. and Saigon delegations used one door, while the DRVN and NLF delegations used the other. The first session was an important event. The entire world turned its attention on Kleber Center in hopes that the conference would find an early solution to end the war, which had already caused a decade of extensive suffering. Journalists arrived in large numbers. The people of Paris, in particular our overseas Vietnamese compatriots, held aloft red DRVN flags with gold stars and blue and red NLF flags with gold stars to welcome our 2 delegations. Here, and there were several 3-striped red and yellow flags representing the Saigon administration. It is hard to describe the feelings of our overseas Vietnamese kin when they saw the flags of our homeland and the National Liberation Front flying in the middle of Paris. This was particularly true on the opening day of the Paris conference, an important event tied to our people's heroic and painful struggle. Uncountable lives have been lost under those 2 glorious flags. One elderly overseas Vietnamese expressed his deep emotion. "For so many years," he said, "we haven't been allowed to display our flag. Some have been imprisoned just for holding aloft our flag. Now we see our people raising high our country's flag, and we see the French police escorting our representatives through Paris. We could not be happier. As for us, we had the honor to arrive in Paris as representatives for the people of Vietnam sectors. The people of the North and of the South were engaged in a long war against those who would deny us independence. We understood that even though our mission presented us with many difficulties, our challenges could never compare with the martyrdom of our warriors in the battlefields. We knew that we stood on a diplomatic front line, which strove to contribute to victory on the battlefield. Every Thursday for 4 years, our 2 delegations arrived at the Kleber International Conference Center to accomplish our primary responsibility. Through public discussion, we would expose to the world the American scheme of invasion and thus clarify our just cause for the independence, freedom, and reunification of our people. It is worth noting that 3 delegations at the conference did not include any women. The delegation from the Saigon administration did have Madame Nguyen Thi Binh at the beginning, but then we never saw her again. Only the NLF-PRG delegation had long-haired warriors from the South in Paris. There is also the interesting question of technical equipment. The DRVN and NLF delegations had only one small tape deck to record each delegation's speeches, whereas the U.S. side had every type of modern equipment and could consult directly with Washington. In truth, the disparity of forces at Paris was rather unequal. However, we were not lacking in argumentation, particularly when everyone could see Comrade Xuan Thuy's firm, composed, self-possessed demeanor. In June 1969, after formation of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG, of the Republic of South Vietnam, Tran Bu Kim, the NLF's head of delegation, returned to serve as Minister for our Office of Government. I received the heavy responsibility of replacing him. Xuan Thuy and I served as delegation leaders until the conclusion of the conference. During the 5 years of the Paris Conference, the head of the U.S. delegation changed 5 times: Avril Harriman, Henry Cabot Lodge, Philip Habib, David K. E. Bruce, and William J. Porter. Many commentators joked, "The Viet Cong will definitely win because they are so steady." This disparity in management of personnel illustrated our iron will. At the conference table, I usually paid close attention to the 2 opposing delegations, particularly to the delegation from the Saigon administration, which Pham Dang Lam headed for many years. As I looked at them, I would ask myself, what are they thinking about the future of the country and themselves? In truth, Mr. Lam and many people on the delegation of the Saigon administration did not face us with an attitude of enmity. Later, I learned that Pham Dang Lam's homeland was in Binh Tre province and that he had many friends within the ranks of the NLF. For Tet, the Lunar New Year of the Rooster, 1969. The overseas Vietnamese in Paris organized splendid festivities to welcome the DRVN and NLF delegations. One large meeting at the Mutualite Meeting Hall gathered together several thousand overseas Vietnamese compatriots and friends from France and other nations. The elderly, the brothers and sisters who were laborers, and those who were intellectuals grasped our hands, reluctant to part. A formally dressed man of about 30 came up to me. "Do you remember me?" He said, "I was your student at Nam Viet School. Now, I have a doctorate. Truly, my time as a teacher had been a long time before." During 1954 to 1955, Duy Lien and I taught at Nam Viet School, which was headed by Professor Pham Huy Thong. So much water had flowed under the bridge since that time. I regret that I did not have time to ask my former student for his name. I was delighted that he had valued our teaching. In April 1969, I visited England. During the war in Vietnam, Great Britain, the closest U.S. ally in Europe, supported the U.S. policy of aggression. Therefore, members of NLF organizations could not secure visas to England. But by 1969, the United States sat at the same table with the National Liberation Front at the Paris Conference. Great Britain no longer had any reason to hinder us. My visit to England was an event. British friends were delighted and organized an enthusiastic welcome. Many organizations in England supported our struggle, but for many reasons, these activists could not coordinate their activities. Nevertheless, a forest of people congregated at Trafalgar Square, the largest public square in London. The participants paraded with banners announcing solidarity with Vietnam and stop the war. Our British friends led me up to the base of the statue, the highest place in the square, so I could speak. Whenever the representatives of the various organizations spoke, people in the audience erupted into heated discussions among themselves, creating a turbulent atmosphere. Yet when the MC introduced a representative of Vietnam, everyone became quiet. Each person strained to hear. At first, standing up there so high, I felt rather nervous, but after a few minutes facing the sympathetic attitude and respect emanating from the audience, I became forceful. At the end of the rally, my friends and the organizing committee accompanied me in a march where I was flanked by 2 rows of tall, stout security guards. Indeed, it was true that in the imperialist countries, the government's policy and the people's wishes were opposite. The people of every country value justice. Their deep wish is always tied directly to a peaceful life and friendly relationships. During that visit, I also had the chance to meet directly with members from the Labour Party in the British Parliament. I described for them the Vietnamese situation and our position. During the mid and late 1960s and early 1970s, many remarkable events occurred in the U.S. anti-war movement. Norman Morrison immolated himself at the Pentagon. The student movement erupted on college campuses. National Guardsmen killed 4 students during a demonstration at Kent State University, and there were massive vigils in Washington and other cities. Late in April 1969, I returned to Hanoi to receive new directives. I visited my father in the Soviet Vietnamese Friendship Hospital, where he had been hospitalized for several months. That was the last time I saw my father. At the end of May, while in Paris, I received the news of his death. I was in immense pain, reproaching myself that I had not been at his side during his last moments. During that same trip back home, Uncle Ho invited me to visit and share a meal. He inquired about the work of the negotiations in Paris and about the overseas Vietnamese compatriots in France and England. Uncle Ho reminded me about the importance of taking part in the campaigns of people from different countries, since these ordinary people were the ones who truly valued justice and peace. I did not realize that this would be the last time I would meet with Uncle Ho. I brought back with me to the conference the front's 10-point solution. Comrade Tram Bu Kim, head of the NLF delegation, announced this position in the meeting at Kleber Center on May 8, 1969. The impact of the 10 points was huge, especially on American public opinion. These points explained the forceful actions that had such a decisive effect in the United States at that time. Then in early September came the event that brought us relentless sorrow. Uncle Ho, the esteemed father of our nation, passed away when the efforts of our people reached a decisive phase. On September 2nd, Comrade Xuan Thuy and I returned to Hanoi in mourning for Uncle Ho. The whole country was in deep sorrow. Asterisk, Asterisk, asterisk. Although I have mentioned the shift from the NLF to the PRG before, I feel a fuller explanation might be useful. The National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, which had been established 8 years before with good weather, favorable terrain, and concord among the people, had grown like Phu Dong. We had established NLF committees in each area of the South, including in areas the enemy temporarily occupied. Other countries, including many socialist countries and other friendly nations, had officially recognized the NLF as a government, even though we still used the front in our name. However, we had reached a point where we needed to establish a government in order to manage the increase in our liberated areas and to have an official voice for the people of the South in the international arena. On June 6, 1969, we formally established the Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG, of the Republic of South Vietnam with 12 domestic and foreign policies. Here was a new development in our resistance. Movement against the United States in South Vietnam. The government had an advisory council with lawyer Nguyen Thi Binh as president, lawyer Trinh Dinh Thao as vice president, and with the participation of many other patriotic intellectuals. The head of government was architect Nguyen Thi Binh. At the time, I was in Paris. The newly formed government in the South selected me as foreign minister and simultaneously as head of our PRG delegation at the Four-Party Paris Conference. I succeeded Comrade Tran Bu Kim, who returned to Vietnam to serve as Minister of the Office of Government. To be honest, I was not pleased to hear about my appointment as foreign minister, for I saw that my responsibilities would be far heavier. The announcement of the foundation of the PRG was an important event. People inside the country were delighted. Saigon was in an uproar, and international public opinion paid close attention. We predicted several possibilities when we announced at the negotiations that I would be replacing Comrade Tran Bu Kim as our delegation's head, and when we simultaneously announced that we would be taking part in the meetings as the newly established Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. For example, the U.S. representatives might have objected and stopped the talks. We certainly did not expect to hear the American head of delegation gasp in surprise and then say, "Your choice of representative is your internal affair." For our two delegations, those celebratory days in Paris were like a festival. I received many flowers and congratulatory cards and was constantly meeting delegations. The DRVN delegation, led by Comrade Lo Duc Tho and Comrade Xuan Thuy, arrived first. Then the Soviet, Chinese, and Cuban ambassadors to France arrived to present their congratulations and announce their government's formal diplomatic recognition of the PRG. Then the Association of Overseas Vietnamese in France, the French Communist Party, and representatives of mass organizations of women, youth, and laborers arrived in turn. International journalists quickly announced the news. Within a short time, 20 countries announced their official diplomatic recognition of the PRG. These included Cuba and Algeria, two special friends of Vietnam. Most of these other nations were also in the socialist camp. With these steps, our representation of the South at the conference table became even more articulate, tenacious, and dignified. Our delegation's composition did not change significantly. I replaced Comrade Tran Bu Kim as delegation head. Comrade Dinh Ba and Nguyen Văn Tien became deputy head. Sister Due Lien returned home, but Sister Nguyen Thi Chan joined us. And then, the following year, Sister Phan Thi Minh Avit, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Our delegation in Paris was based mainly at Villiers-le-Buisson, Cambacérès Road, with part of the group at Massy, 5 or 6 kilometers away in a working-class area. Our whole delegation had 30 people, including officials and support personnel. Only 10 of us, myself, Bin Tan, several protocol officials, and security personnel, lived at Verrières-Buissons in an old, scenic villa atop a broad hill overlooking a lake with swans. Indeed, it was a poetic setting. Behind the villa was a small garden with a dozen cherry trees. In the afternoon, we women in the delegation would often pick cherries and chat. The comrades responsible for cooking our meals planted a small vegetable garden and raised chickens in the yard between the villa's kitchen and the row of neighboring houses. After our nerve-wracking work sessions, we diplomats would water the vegetables and feed the chickens as a diversion. We lived at the Verrières-Buissons villa for 5 years. 5 years of the swan's life on the lake, and 5 years history can never forget. The French government provided a police escort whenever the delegation traveled in an official capacity. A police car led the procession, while the car with the head of delegation had 4 motorcycle escorts, with 2 on each side. Whenever the entire delegation went to a meeting at Kleber Conference Center, we became a cavalcade led by a police car and 8 accompanying police officers on motorcycles. The French Communist Party was the organization most helpful to the delegation. We had only a few security officers from Vietnam. The French Communist Party supplied all the other security officials and the vehicle drivers as a contribution. Most members of our PRG delegation were political officials from many different local areas and different state branches. We had only one military official. We worked together amidst great unity, for we shared deep feelings about our parentage and heritage in the South. We constantly thought of our loved ones struggling in our ancestral villages and felt we must execute our responsibilities to the very best of our abilities. Binh Thanh, mi set stati, was a very sensitive person. She would often say, "Ours is an endearing community. We seldom went out just for the fun of it." Although we would occasionally gather up the entire delegation and go to a park or to the forest to gather mushrooms. The house at Massey had 2 ping-pong tables. In the evenings, the brothers and sisters that would play ping-pong or bowls. The foreign press, in particular the French, would compare our delegation with the one from the Saigon administration. With high salaries supported by the United States, the Saigon administration delegates had the means to visit many entertainment sites in and around Paris. Some journalists wrote that our office was like a monastery of men without their wives and a convent of women without their husbands. We lived frugally, economizing whenever and wherever we could. Some journalists wanted to film the daily living conditions of the head of the Viet Cong delegation, but we firmly declined, offering the excuse that Vietnamese customs would not approve of publicizing a woman's private living quarters. The truth is that we could hardly show anyone the room where Bin Thanh and I lived. It was upstairs, directly under the mansard roof. The space was so tight that our 2 beds were as close together as cots in a Vietnamese hospital ward. Curious journalists sometimes asked where I went to have an Ao made, where I went to the hairdresser, and which beauty salon I used. I would provide an elusive answer by way of an anecdote. Some reporters would ask in a fault-finding tone, "Aren't you a member of the Communist Party?" I would smile and answer, "I'm a patriot. My party is a patriotic party determined to struggle for our country's independence and freedom." Then there were the journalists who commented, "Your name means peace, but you speak only of war." How could I respond to that challenge except by raising the question of the American war of aggression and by speaking clearly about the meaning of our people's determination to achieve peace, independence, and freedom? Those journalists had to conclude that we never wanted war. Rather, the French colonizers and the American imperialists had forced our people to stand up and defend themselves. To sharpen our arguments at the negotiating table and to buttress wider public discussion, We read books about world history, and particularly about our own country's history. I especially liked to read about the period of Le, Loy, and Nguyen Thi in the 15th century. 500 years before us, our ancestors had organized a very skillful, coordinated struggle on three fronts: political, military, and diplomatic. Nguyen Thi's diplomatic letters were unsurpassable, at times strong and at times conciliatory, as he pressured and persuaded his Chinese opponents to withdraw their troops from our country. Nearly 6 centuries later, we were following our country's tradition of fighting the aggressors. Like our forefathers, we were using both bravery and intelligence. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In addition to preparing for meetings at Kleber Conference Center, we had to set aside considerable time to meet with the press. For me, there were periods when it seemed like I was meeting daily with 1 or 2 television companies or with journalists from newspapers in France, the United States, Great Britain, and Japan. The list goes on. In general, the attitude of the press was sympathetic toward the DRVN delegation, and particularly toward the PRG delegation. The brothers in the 2 delegations would tease us, saying, "The Westerners fawn over you women." We faced highly sensitive issues. We would discuss them extensively to reach unified, appropriate answers. The external relations front was its own battlefield. Perhaps we can say that we viewed our arguments presented at any given point as also leading to our country's victory. Our opponents and the journalists would persist in asking whether northern Vietnamese troops were in the South. We had received a directive. You must not say northern troops are in the South. You must not say northern troops are not in the South. And so, I would answer, the Vietnamese people are one. The Vietnamese in the North, just like the Vietnamese in the South, all have the same obligation towards society to fight against aggression. The journalists would turn their questions this way and turn them that way, but I would hold to that one approach whenever I answered. In the end, the persistent journalists had to reconcile themselves to accepting my response as stated. In 1969, we announced that our liberated area covered 2/3 of the South. Then, in 1971, we announced that we had expanded our liberated area to 3/4 of the South. At that time, our main force troops in the battlefield faced many difficulties. The war had forced some of our troops to slip over the border into Cambodia. The enemy bombed everywhere, even the areas just outside Saigon. We discussed with each other how to respond to journalists. The United States is bombing everywhere, I would say. Most of the places the United States has destroyed are in our liberated areas. If it is not true that we control so much territory, then why is the United States bombing everywhere? This reasoning was so clear that it caused the journalists to nod their heads in agreement. I remember most of all a large meeting in the middle of 1971 with TV journalists. French television had taken the initiative to organize a live, simultaneous broadcast from 2 sites, one in Paris and one in Washington. 20 journalists took part. 10, who were mostly Americans, would protect the U.S. position. 10 others, who were mostly French, would be neutral and objective. I was invited to take part, but I wavered. I kept thinking I would be all by myself and stupefied in the midst of so many sharp-tongued journalists. I had never met any of them, and I would have to debate directly in French. Comrade Nguyen Thi Binh, our press attaché, and the other brothers and sisters in our delegation encouraged me. They said this was a great opportunity to introduce the entire world to our position and to expose the U.S. schemes and cruelty. And so, they said, I should make the most of this opportunity. The broadcast was nearly 2 tension-filled hours under bright studio lights. For the most part, the journalists focused on the usual positions of the United States and Vietnam at the negotiating table. Although my heart was thumping, I try to be calm and answer with composure and strength, but also with courteous affability. I explained our good intentions and our wish to find a political solution to end our people's pain and suffering. At the same time, I expressed our determination to achieve inviolable freedom, independence, and unification for our country. At the end of the meeting, I breathed a huge sigh of relief because I had completed a very difficult assignment. Comrade Nguyen Thi phoned me with praise. "You were courageous," he said. Many French friends, especially the women, telephoned their congratulations, saying the broadcast was an important success. Days later, members of the press were still talking about that event. We were always looking for new initiatives to expand our influence. One action was very special. From Paris, we organized with our friends in New York and Annawar, meeting coordinated across the Atlantic Ocean. At the appointed hour, our friends in New York phoned to inform us that everyone had arrived at the meeting hall. They asked us to speak to the meeting by telephone. I spoke, and Benton interpreted. The applause was enthusiastic. We could not hear clearly when the Americans spoke, but we could guess the contents. This innovation contributed to U.S. understanding of our position and created greater sympathy. However, not every initiative was successful. We had noticed that more than a few senators and representatives in the U.S. Congress opposed the war. I discussed with older brother Lai Van Sao the idea of writing a letter to the U.S. Congress in hopes that Congress would contemplate the American tradition honoring freedom and think about the American youth who had died in Vietnam. The arguments presented in the letter carefully weighed the pros and cons. They were mild-mannered and reasonable. A few days after sending the letter, we learned that the U.S. Congress had objected that the letter was not constructive and that, by behaving this way, we were interfering in U.S. internal affairs. This was a small matter, but we did gain from it a greater understanding of a large country's self-conceit, and we learned a lesson in international deportment. The choice of Paris as the site of the negotiations was a large victory for us. Perhaps the United States did not realize that even though Vietnam had fought with France, our nation had many close and supportive French friends, as well as huge community of patriotic overseas Vietnamese. Paris, which at that time was regarded as the center of Europe and the center of world public opinion, provided us with a favorable location for sending news internationally. We could distribute many important news stories very fast from our delegations in Paris to the rest of the world. Those stories included U.S. expansion of the war to Laos and Cambodia, the U.S. escalation of the war to the north, the U.S. destruction in the north, and the U.S. Army's massacres at My Lai, Sun Mai, and other sites. Within a day, people in many countries would take to the streets to oppose the United States and support Vietnam. These news releases also quickly opposed the heavy-handed actions in the urban centers of South Vietnam. Many Vietnamese from the South who visited Paris told us that it was primarily through the news from other countries that they could understand clearly the situation in the South. In this way, they also came to understand the National Liberation Front and, later, the Provisional Revolutionary Government. Through daily press and television briefings, people could follow closely the battles of Vietnamese regular troops and guerrillas against American Marines. Politicians wanted to watch how the diplomatic arguments played out in Paris between the two warring sides. One side in Paris was allied with communism and socialism, with representatives connected to the North Vietnamese Army and the Liberation Army of South Vietnam. The other side was allied with the Western imperialists led by the United States, with representatives connected to the U.S. Army and the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, along with the televised scenes of bloody battles and deaths on the battlefield in Vietnam. The maneuvering at the Paris conference involved complicated arguments between the sides as they pursued complex, opposing national and individual interests. Some people tried to use the Soviet Union and China, two of our major allies, to pressure Vietnam. Through quick-minded observation, we could perceive these dynamics from both our adversaries' public actions and their clandestine behavior around the edges of the Paris conference. We were conscious of this situation and of the need for careful discipline in our public statements. Indeed, at times we would say something in public, but then the newspapers would unintentionally or sometimes with direct intention print completely different contents. We constantly had to screen every point and learn from experience. We met many political leaders as well as journalists at various embassy festivities for different countries' national days. Guests would chat about the news. We brothers and sisters were skillful in picking up information, which gave us insight into the issues and the opinions of the various guests. The home of Madame Geneviève Tabouis, a politician and famous French journalist, was a favorite gathering place. Many well-known French political leaders, political activists, retired generals, and eminent journalists came to discuss current affairs. Surely, the guests also included people working in strategic intelligence. I was often invited to Saturday afternoon. Thea, along with Nguyen Thi and Louis Gong, Tuong, both from the DRVN delegation. From the discussions, we understood that the other guests really did want to understand our intentions and to learn where we were headed and when there would be real negotiations. Many people also made the observation common in French political circles that the United States will surely be defeated because before, the French were wiser in military strategy and tactics, but nevertheless met defeat. The French political authorities probably would have been willing to serve as mediators between the United States and the DRVN-PRG. The French sought clarity about whether the peace cabinet about to appear in Saigon would have people who were close to France. Individual French people who knew us tried to sound out political issues involving a possible new administration in the South, while they simultaneously tried to sound out the U.S. side. In general, though, the French government was respectful and strove to maintain its neutral role as the host country. During the negotiations, we had many methods to preserve our secrecy and security. One aspect of our success was the political environment in France. We managed to keep all our diplomatic offensives secret to the very last moment, creating the element of surprise that perplexed and disconcerted our opponents. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. During our nearly 5 years in Paris, in addition to our work directly relating to the negotiations, my comrades and I in the NLF-PRG delegation would visit other countries to attend conferences and solidarity meetings. We took advantage of any invitation from any organization in any country, whether in France, Italy, Africa, or the Americas. Our goal was to maximize the opportunities to explain our position and to mobilize the various strata of people, political parties, and governments. In France, ordinary people were very sympathetic with Vietnam. The French Communist Party had substantial political influence at that time and was a solid support, helping in particular with the solidarity movement by drawing in people from every segment of society. Especially important was the support from a number of world-renowned intellectuals. These included writer and philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous mathematician, Laurent Schwartz, and the venerable lawyer, Joan Norman, the French president of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. These famous people held opposing political views and would often challenge one another, but they agreed on the issue of Vietnam. Each one spoke out in strong support of Vietnam's struggle. Vietnam's indomitable, Heroic efforts were a source of inspiration for many French writers and poets. There were those who said, "I wish, when waking up in the morning, to be Vietnamese." The women in the Union of French Women, UFF, were especially constructive. They organized many initiatives in support of Vietnam. These sisters would joke with me, and they would say, "The French people know more about you than about our French president." The General Confederation of Workers, CGT, was also enthusiastic. "I think we need to help our Vietnamese people understand everything our friends did to help us before and afterwards, and especially during the time of the negotiations in Paris. To them we owe a huge debt of gratitude, which we must never forget." Traveling from France to Italy required very little effort. The Italian people's movement supporting Vietnam was very strong, particularly among the youth and trade union members. Many communist activists and representatives from other political parties in the parliament spoke up in support of us, demanding that the United States stop the war. We went many times to Bologna, where the Italian Communist Party had a great deal of influence. I was invited to the parliament to speak about the war. A movement developed to support the health of the Vietnamese by donating blood. Whenever our delegations went to visit, we felt like special guests, with the police escorting us as if we were heads of state. Comrades Trong Tung and Ha Dang still refer to our historic visits to Bologna. For me, the deepest and most emotional memories are from Sweden. The Swedish people, in particular the youth, loved and supported Vietnam. Many youth called themselves Swedish Viet Cong. One time we had just landed at the airport when we saw 2 rows of Swedish youth with blue and red NLF flags. They sang, "Liberate the South," in Swedish to welcome us. Some young friends in the movement came from wealthy families. At first, their parents were angry, but then they noticed that their children became better behaved and more dignified through their political activities. In the end, the parents shifted to supporting us and encouraging their children's work for Vietnam. Here is one special case. Some youth, who called themselves FNL, the letters abbreviating the National Liberation Front in Swedish, had established a Viet Cong liberated area in an abandoned building in the center of the capital. There, the FNL youth set up a printing press and published a newsletter, which they distributed across the various strata of Swedish society. The 2 Swedes whom I especially esteemed were Prime Minister Olof Palme and writer Sarah Lidman. At the beginning of 1970, Prime Minister Palme instructed Mr. Christoph Oberg to invite me to take part in the Swedish Social Democratic Party Congress and to speak about the American War in Vietnam. I was the only foreign representative at the Congress. During that same visit, a huge demonstration had been organized in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, in support of the Vietnamese people's struggle. I joined the Prime Minister in leading that demonstration. Writer Sarah Lidman was famous in Northern Europe. She had written many books protecting the interests of farmers in remote areas. Here was a person with a heart of gold. She felt great admiration and sympathy for Vietnam, a small and impoverished nation standing up in heroic valor against the United States, a colossal and imperialistic country. She viewed Vietnam as the symbol for ethical choices and as the heart of humanity. Perhaps there are no words more beautiful than Sarah Lidman's to describe Vietnam. Sarah Lidman visited Vietnam in the midst of the war and became even more admiring and sympathetic when she saw the women and children living under the Americans' cruel bombs. Yet she also saw that these people remained calm and optimistic about the struggle, for they believed we would be victorious in the end. Sarah Lidman was also attentive to the relationship between people within our families and our society. Older sister Ben, she said, Vietnam has a culture that is endlessly precious. People live together with feeling and meaning in a beautiful way. In Europe, we've become uncivilized and know only about living to please ourselves. We're bent on winning for ourselves at any cost. These days, in truth, the words of this dear Swedish friend are worth a great deal of thought. Indeed, during those years of war, we Vietnamese truly did live in a society which was good and strong. I believe that we Vietnamese today can draw from our wartime society a deep source of strength, which we must always preserve. In truth, the return of peace brings difficulties greater than in war. I know many close friends have worried about us with respect to this very point. Sarah Lidman was among them. She was not a communist, and she did not speak about class struggle or socialism. She had a soul which was clear and noble, and so she placed a high value on equality and compassion while hating injustice, oppression, and exploitation. When I would share confidences with her about the weaknesses that remained in our society, she would always find a way to defend us and cover this up. Sarah passed away several years ago in her home village, a tranquil rural area in the south of Sweden. She was a marvelous friend whom we can never forget. I also often think of Algeria, a place where people would refer to Viet Nam as their older brother and older sister. Vietnam and Algeria were close through a special, shared history. In 1954, we had just finished our war of resistance against France with a glorious victory in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu when the Algerians began their military struggle, which lasted until 1962. Only then, after the Avion Agreement, did Algeria secure independence and freedom from the French colonialists. Algerians regarded Vietnam with gratitude and felt the Vietnamese people had opened the way for Algeria's struggle as well as for the worldwide national independence movement. Starting from this special relationship, the Algerian government, the Algerian FNL, Front for National Liberation Party, and the Algerian people continuously supported Vietnam when we were forced to fight the United States. Paris and Algiers are not far apart. We had many chances to travel to Algiers and discuss with our friends the situation of the struggle inside our country and the negotiations in Paris. President Boumediene and Foreign Minister Bouteflika consider me a close friend and reserved. For me in Algiers, a private villa, which our friends called Madame Ben's Villa. At the time, Algeria played an important role in the non-aligned movement, NAM, and was central in helping the NLF-PRG take part. Their help came at the time when the countries in NAM that had a strong relationship with the United States and the Saigon administration looked for ways to hamper us. In the middle of 1970, I went to visit Yugoslavia. As soon as I set foot there, I remember the books I had read during the beginning of my efforts to oppose French colonialism. Those texts described the anti-fascist war and Yugoslavia's guerrilla movement, in which President Tito was the iconic image and for which he was subsequently honored as a national hero. After World War II, Yugoslavia backed the banding spirit and joined the non-aligned movement. Later, splits in the labor movement and in international communism made it difficult for Yugoslavia. As a result, the country's international importance declined. Nevertheless, President Tito and the Yugoslav government were consistent in their warm support for the Vietnamese people's struggle during our 2 wars of resistance. After we had signed the Paris Agreement, I visited Yugoslavia once again along with PRG President Nguyen Thi Binh Chapter. President Tito personally drove the car and took us to visit Bruni Island in the Adriatic, where the blue of the sea has a special hue. In the middle of 1970, the battlefield forces between the enemy and us were relatively even. When the negotiations in Paris stalled, I took advantage of the hiatus to visit other countries and attend international conferences. Comrade Din Bati, deputy head of our delegation, replaced me every Thursday at the Kleber Conference Center. In July, we paid an official visit to India at the invitation of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and then traveled on to Sri Lanka at the invitation of Prime Minister Bandaranaike. At this time, Delhi had 2 Vietnamese consulates, one for the DRVN and one for the Saigon administration. The Saigon consul objected when he heard about our delegation's arrival. He left India for home. His action was a defeat for the Saigon administration because I had come through an official invitation from the Indian government. The Indian government replied to his objection, saying, "Whomever we invite is our right." Indian political circles were divided. Traveling along the road, we could see 2 kinds of signs: "Welcome, Madam Ben," and "Madam Ben, go home." When journalists asked my impressions, I said, "The Indian people support us, for which we are very thankful. After this visit, we'll return home." India was very hot in July, but wherever we went, people poured out onto the streets, particularly in Calcutta, now Kolkata. Many people approached us to grasp our hands, while others kissed the hems of my Audai. At the time, the Indians had a famous slogan, "You are Vietnam." "I am Vietnam." "We are Vietnam." Many people supported us, but some did not. In quite a few places, Indians argued with each other about red flags or black flags. We were pleased that there were always more red flags. This visit was the first time I met Madam Indira Gandhi, about whom I had heard so much praise. She was the daughter of Elder Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, a huge country, which had achieved independence. After nearly 100 years of imperialist British domination, Madam Indira Gandhi had taken the name of her husband, Feroz Gandhi, also a politician and a famous journalist. When Indira Gandhi was young, she accompanied her father, who conscientiously trained her to become a high-level politician. She was proud to be a niece of Uncle Ho. I had a deep and positive impression of Indira Gandhi, not only because of her dignified, serious appearance and her noble bearing, but also from her political acumen. During that visit to India, I came to understand more about one of the oldest and greatest cultures in Asia. At the same time, I was deeply impressed by the warm feelings of the Indian people toward Uncle Ho in Vietnam. My visit to India created a positive effect on Indian public opinion, with the result that, subsequently, the Indian government made an important decision which enhanced our prestige. Previously, India and Poland had been 2 of the countries on the International Commission for Supervision and Control of the implementation of the 1954 Geneva Agreements on Vietnam and Laos. To maintain neutrality, India had established a general consulate in Hanoi and another in Saigon. Then, in the beginning of 1972, India established formal diplomatic relations with the DRVN and opened an embassy in Hanoi. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. On September 17, 1970, we at the Paris negotiations began another diplomatic offensive with the PRG's 8 points. We demanded that the United States withdraw all its troops before June 30, 1971, set aside the Phu Kai Kim administration, and establish a provisional coalition government in the South. The 8 points created reverberations, which resounded throughout the urban areas of the South. Those points received worldwide acclaim as part of a flexible and reasonable proposal. In addition to my responsibilities as foreign minister and delegation head at the Paris conference, I had an assignment as traveling diplomatic representative for the PRG state. My task was to encourage other governments to establish official diplomatic relations with the PRG. By 1970, 24 governments had diplomatic relations with the Provisional Revolutionary Government. Our official participation in the non-aligned movement became a major goal for expanding the PRG's international position. At that time, the non-aligned movement included more than 100 Third World member nations from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. NAM's guidelines were to struggle for independence and non-alignment. That is, not to follow the side of socialism, but also not to follow the side of Western capitalism. The NLFPRG platform, with its position regarding peaceful foreign affairs and neutrality, conformed appropriately to NAM's guiding principles. Although we had many friends in NAM, admission was not easy. In September 1970, I received directions along with comrades Ngoc Dung, Ben Thanh, Lai Van Sao, and Lamai to go to Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, to lobby in this important campaign. We arrived in Tanzania and expected to travel from there to Zambia, but we couldn't find any way to fly to Zambia from Tanzania's largest city, Dar es Salaam. The date for the meeting of NAM heads of state was imminent. It was all very confusing. We were fortunate to meet older Sister Maria, the private secretary of Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere, a major African politician who was sympathetic to Vietnam's struggle. Older Sister Maria suggested we ask if we could travel on the president's special airplane. I want to see the president and presented our problem. He was delighted to receive our request, and so the 5 of us boarded the president's special plane. We were even more delighted that Ugandan President Obote traveled with us. While on the airplane, I sat between the 2 presidents. The trip gave us time to talk. When our delegation landed at the airport, the Zambians greeted me formally as if I were a head of state. The foreign ministers met first. The meeting of heads of state would follow. At the foreign ministers' meeting, comrades from Cuba and Algeria suggested admitting the PRG. Hectic activity ensued. Some African countries maintained close relations with the United States and the Saigon administration. They objected, while other countries had no position. In the end, the meeting decided that, as a first step, the PRG could have observer status. This was an important victory. From that point forward, the PRG's diplomatic status changed. I was invited to speak at the meeting of heads of state. Everyone was attentive. The next day, I want to give my greetings to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and to President Nyerere to thank them for the support of India and Tanzania. Many heads of state wanted to meet the Madam Foreign Minister of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. Notable among them was President Bokassa of the Central African Republic. He had served as a French legionnaire in Vietnam. The head of state for Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie, was elegantly dressed as would befit a royal personage. He moved forward in the midst of a large and obsequious entourage of junior officials. The appearance of a woman as the foreign minister from a struggling country, which was the center of world attention, caused the emperor and his delegation to take notice and even to show some sympathy. During subsequent years, I always received support from Asian and African delegations at international conferences. I worked in close coordination with them, especially on matters related to Vietnam, anti-imperialism, and opposition to wars of aggression. Many foreign ministers whom I knew during those years later became heads of state, for example, in Algeria, Madagascar, and Mali. These leaders retained good feelings toward Vietnam and toward me personally. In October 1970, I visited Bulgaria, the country of roses. Bulgaria is a prosperous agricultural country, which produces flowers and fruits said to be the best in Europe. Comrade Todor Zhivkov, the General Secretary of the Bulgarian Communist Party, welcomed me with great enthusiasm. During a consultative meeting with the Bulgarian foreign minister, we received news of the death of former French President Charles de Gaulle. I returned to Paris in order to represent the PRG at President de Gaulle's state funeral. This was a very solemn affair, with many heads of state delegations from all continents. After the funeral, I returned to Bulgaria. In early 1971, I visited Cuba. Comrade Fidel Castro called that year the year of solidarity with Vietnam. My visit opened with a huge rally in Jose Marti Square. I had the feeling that all of Havana was present. There, Comrade Fidel promulgated his famous, fiery slogan, "Cuba is ready to dedicate all her blood for Vietnam." The atmosphere was intensely emotional, with everyone shouting, "Vietnam, Cuba, and Americans out of Vietnam." Later, the Vietnamese embassy reported that it had received thousands of letters from Cuban citizens volunteering to fight alongside their comrades in Vietnam. Solidarity with Vietnam penetrated every family and every Cuban, from senior citizens to children. The children of Comrade Roll. Castro and Vilma Espin were young, about 11 or 12 years old. The older son came with his mother to visit me. He was startled to see my long hair. He asked, "May I go to Vietnam and fight?" I was so touched. "Aren't you afraid of dying?" I asked. "If I die," he answered with pride, "I'll be a martyr." In 1972, the foreign ministers from countries in the non-aligned movement met in Georgetown, Guyana. Comrade Hong Bich Sun, the PRG deputy foreign minister, led our delegation to lobby for the PRG's full membership in a non-aligned movement. The delegation's efforts were such that a majority of nations approved our application at the conference the following year. In June 1973, at the meeting of heads of state in Algeria, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam was recognized as an official member of the non-aligned movement. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It would be a major oversight if I did not mention my visits to the Soviet Union and China during the years of the Paris Conference. I cannot remember how many official visits I made to the Soviet Union, China, and most of the socialist countries of Eastern Europe. The governments and the people there consistently expressed tremendous goodwill toward Vietnam. The assistance from the Soviet and Chinese peoples during our struggle was enormous. I attended rallies held by the Communist Party, the state, and the people of China at Beijing's Great Hall with tens of thousands in attendance. And I joined solemn meetings with Soviet leaders at the Grand Kremlin Palace. Every time we returned from France to Vietnam, we stopped off in Moscow and Beijing. We felt safe and welcome there, as if we were at home. In those years, the empathy between us was deep and sincere. In 1971, the situation on the battlefield became very tense. The mental battle at the conference table was also tense. By late 1971 and early 1972, the balance of forces was precarious. The Paris Conference continued, but as the journalists wrote, our discussions were like verbal, just between deaf people. Perhaps I can say that this was the worst time for us. At times, we became especially homesick. I read and reread my daughter my squiggly lines. By then, she was 11 years old. She wasn't even 8 when I left for Paris. She wrote, "When will you return to us, children?" My husband was still teaching at the Army Engineering School, but his health had begun to decline. This added to my worries and left me feeling helpless because I could not be nearby to care for him. That was my personal mood. I knew that each person in our delegation had his or her own personal challenges, anxieties, and mood swings. However, through all this, we always held on to this special point. We never thought Vietnam could be defeated. We were determined to achieve victory. The only question was when. In February 1971, The United States launched an offensive on Route 9 in southern Laos to cut off the north-south supply route, thereby hoping to isolate and encircle our Liberation Army. The Americans' efforts ended in miserable failure. From Paris, we sent our reports to Stockholm, Rome, Montreal, and New York. We described clearly the U.S. expansion of aggression into Laos. The news spread immediately from those sites to other countries. At meetings and demonstrations, countless participants condemned the United States and demanded that the United States stop escalating the war. During those days, our two delegations from the North and the South were terribly busy. We quickly implemented what we called our diplomacy coordinated with the battlefield. More than a month later, the American and puppet troops were forced to withdraw from southern Laos after they had suffered huge military and political losses. Our position was visibly strengthened. On reflection, I think perhaps it can be said that the warriors in Paris at that time also contributed their small and indirect part to the victory in Laos that year. On July 1st, 1971, the PRG delegation announced its 7-point program. The points included withdrawal of all U.S. troops in concert with the release of political prisoners and the Saigon administration's acceptance of a new administration ready to discuss with the PRG the establishment of a national reconciliation government. In this way, we separated the contentious aspects of U.S. withdrawal from the political issues involving the South. Here was another wise step. Diplomacy can work that way. Flexibility can be an offensive. This initiative had a huge effect by generating positive world opinion and support from many governments. Washington searched for other schemes. Kissinger and then Nixon visited Beijing. They wanted to make everyone think the major powers would resolve the war among themselves. They hoped to drive a wedge between the USSR and China. Foreign media covered in detail the secret meetings in Shanghai between the United States and China, as well as China's public statement too. The effect of, if you don't touch us, then we won't touch you. I believe history will remember this unusual secret meeting. Yet nothing could deter our people in Vietnam's two sectors, the North and the South. Indeed, our determination on the military, political, and diplomatic fronts grew even stronger. Our return to Hanoi in the middle of 1971, when we had large floods in the north. The Army and the people struggled to combat the new U.S. air war and to protect the Red River dikes. The Army had to destroy some embankments protecting Hanoi's Gia Lam district in order to keep the center of Hanoi from flooding. In March 1972, our Army and people began a large offensive in three important directions: the eastern sector of the South, the Central Highlands, and Quang Tri, Thua Thien provinces in the northern part of South Vietnam. The Quang Tri campaign, which lasted until September 1972, was among the war's fiercest battles. By early 1972, I was back in Paris and continued attending the meetings at Kleber Conference Center every Thursday morning. At this time, as before, the battlefield was tense, while the conference table was also tense. Our feelings of discontent continued. We did not know when we would overcome the deadlock. Nevertheless, we continued publicizing the deceptions and endless cruelties of the U.S. Thieu administration. We continued to demand that the United States completely withdraw its troops. On January 11th, 1972, I received a directive to announce our 2 points: withdraw American troops and form in the South a national government of concord drawn from 3 sectors: the PRG, the Saigon administration, and the Third Force. By this time, our Army was launching a counteroffensive on the battlefield, while the United States was in a presidential election year. The American people were demanding that Nixon bring U.S. troops home. I can say that the PRG's 7-point plan, along with the 2 additional points, including the withdrawal of U.S. troops so that the Vietnamese in the South could solve their own internal issues, were bought. Insightful and timely as strategic policies. World public opinion, and particularly U.S. public opinion, supported this view, whereas our new initiative seemed to disconcert the Saigon administration. Internal conflict among the Saigon authorities increased, as did the citizens' hatred for them. To deceive the American public before the election, the Nixon administration arranged a so-called political solution for the war in Vietnam. The United States agreed with the DRVN to enter into secret talks in Paris. The historic battle of wits between Lê Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger began. It could be said that this was the decisive season on 2 fronts, military and diplomatic. Simultaneously, the American Air Force intended to bomb the Red River dikes during the rainy season's peak. At that time, the DRVN delegation spoke out at the Paris conference against the Americans' cruel scheme. We had invited many international delegations to visit and examine the sites. During that time, Jane Fonda visited the PRG delegation in Paris and shared a meal with me before leaving for Vietnam. Zemsi Clark Chavo with Jane Fonda to Hanoi. He had resigned his cabinet position as President Johnson's Attorney General in 1969 in protest against the U.S. war policy. After returning to the United States from visiting Vietnam in 1972, both Jane Fonda and Ramsey Clark spoke with the authority of those who could say, "Our eyes have seen, our ears have heard." They said clearly that the dikes protecting the Red River Delta were not military emplacements, as the U.S. government had deceptively said in the public media. Mr. Raymond Aubrac, a close friend of ours in France, encouraged the Vatican and the United Nations to speak out and stop the vicious U.S. plan to bomb our protective dikes. The war in our country reached a high point of intensity both in the North and in the South. The United States bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail 24 hours a day. The USA mined ports in the north and blocked our shipping lanes. In Paris, we followed the news from Quang Tri hour by hour, particularly the battle for the famous Quang Tri Citadel. We did not receive specific and timely news, but whatever was announced made our hearts pound. We knew our warriors were very young. Yet we also knew our troops understood that taking the land at that site created the essential image of taking back freedom and independence for our homeland. For that, our soldiers were willing to sacrifice their lives. After 81 destructive days and nights, our troops could no longer hold the Quang Tri-Citadel. But our troops' combat spirit showed Vietnam's unwavering determination. We in Paris understood that this spirit was an important contribution to our struggle at the conference table. During those days, many American groups, mothers, wives of pilots, religious leaders, women, and young activists visited our 2 delegations. I remember in particular Martin Fenrider, the leader of a group with 24 American youth. He presented me with a poem which he had just composed. By the end of September 1972, only 2 months remained before the U.S. presidential elections, creating an opportunity for us to pressure the United States into substantive negotiations. Gomat Le Duc Tho, special advisor to the DRVN delegation, brought from home the Paris Draft Agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. We announced the contents of the draft agreement, which the Politburo in Hanoi had carefully examined. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. From the beginning of negotiations until September 1972, Vietnam's stance had consistently stressed that any whole package solution must fulfill 2 basic requirements: complete and unconditional withdrawal of all U.S. troops from the South and the Remo. VAL of the Saigon administration set up by the United States. These two requirements were interlinked. However, the draft agreement emphasized only the requirement for complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from the South, but relaxed our demands about political issues in the South. After examining the draft agreement, some comrades in the PRG delegation raised questions. If the political issues were left to the South, would we be able to achieve complete liberation? Could we end the war? Experience in Laos after the 1962 Geneva Agreement had shown that a multi-sided coalition government led to civil war. Would that same dynamic play out in Vietnam? What would happen to the tens of thousands of our brothers and sisters who were political prisoners? Could we guarantee their safe release? What would be the appearance and situation in the South after the American troops left? We spent several days in discussions. Yet ultimately we all agreed that total American withdrawal from the South was the crucial issue. For more than 2 months, DRVN advisor Lưu Duc Tho and Minister Xuan Thuy engaged in fiery debates with Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's national security advisor, regarding the draft Paris Agreement. At that time, international public opinion, especially in Paris, described National Security Advisor Kissinger as a wise diplomat with experience in political negotiations. People often ask if I ever met with Kissinger. The truth is that I met him many times, but only indirectly during the debate between the two special advisors, Kissinger and Lưu Duc Tho, in reference to the PRG's positions. Kissinger and I spoke directly with each other only once after the Paris Agreement had been signed. We lifted our champagne glasses and toasted each other, celebrating peace. By early October 1972, the two sides, the DRVN and the United States, had agreed on a basic draft. They set October 30th as the date for signing the Paris Peace Agreement on ending the war. Our two delegations were frantically busy during those days. Our delegation from the South increased its external relations and press releases in order to clarify our position and foil the enemy's die-hard efforts to prolong the war. Representatives from many countries were anxious to know the outcome of the secret talks. We were both excited and worried. As anticipated, in early November 1972, Nixon won the election. In successive, deceitful moves, he demanded changes to the agreement's content. In an effort to force Vietnam to accept his changes, Nixon instigated vicious bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong for 12 days and nights from December 18th until December 29th, 1972. We were terribly worried when we heard the Americans were using B-52 strategic bombers in raids against our capital and our major cities. The B-52s were the Americans' most modern carpet bombers. They flew at a height of 10 kilometers and in the company of a phalanx of fighter jets. Their radar jamming equipment made them difficult to detect and, therefore, made it harder for our missiles to hit their targets. Our friends in France and other countries all worried about us. They wondered, this time could we resist? This was the Americans' most decisive and treacherous thrashing. On December 21st, in protest, we announced cessation of the negotiations. Those were incredibly stressful days. We followed the situation at home very closely. We heard that our troops had shot down a B-52 at Haiphong, and then we heard they had shot one down at Hanoi, and then the list continued. Our soldiers shot down 1, 2, 3, and more B-52s. We were beside ourselves with joy. We were convinced our courageous army and people would defeat the enemy's savage bombardment. In addition to our general anxiety, all of us in the delegation, particularly the women, followed the Americans' assault ever so closely to know the sites where the enemy poured its B-52 bombs. Did the bombs hit our loved ones? Were our children still alive? I was beside myself with anxiety when I heard the Americans had bombed Hung, a provincial capital about 30 kilometers from Hanoi. Had my children survived? I was so fortunate. Several days later, comrades inside the country informed me that my children were safe. I breathed a deep sigh of relief. When I first left Hanoi for Paris to take part in the negotiations, my daughter was 8 years old, while my son was 11. I missed him so much. Every now and then, someone would arrive from home, and I would receive letters from Kang and our children. Every one of the letters from my daughter would ask, "Mother, when are you coming home?" So many families were separated during the 9 years of evacuation of Vietnam cities to avoid losses to civilians from U.S. bombs. The deepest wish of Vietnamese children during that time was to live with their fathers and mothers. I was called home on urgent business. En route, arriving in China. I met Chairman Mao Zedong and a number of other Chinese leaders. Chairman Mao said, "Why do you Vietnamese comrades react so strongly? At some point, the Americans will leave." Since I did not quite understand Chairman Mao's point, I made no comment. In the middle of the night of December 30th, I arrived in Hanoi and heard the news that the United States had stopped the bombing. The Americans were bitter when they saw that even all their B-52s could not dampen our people's will. The bombing was a U.S. military defeat with heavy losses of B-52 airplanes, but the political disaster for the United States was even greater. The whole world condemned the United States. Even the British government, the closest U.S. ally in Europe, issued a statement about British regret in the face of this U.S. action. Years later, I learned that in the 1960s, President Ho Chi Minh had said, "Experience from the Korean War teaches us that the United States will eventually use their B-52s to threaten us." From that point, our military, under the direction of the Ministry of Defense, began to research ways to shoot down B-52s. Indeed, Uncle Ho was forward-looking, and our Army was truly courageous and smart. On January 21st, 1973, I returned to Paris, where the weather was brisk, sunny, and beautiful. On January 23rd, 1973, Comrade Lü Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger initialed the text of the agreement. And then, several days later, on January 27th, we 4 foreign ministers signed a Paris Agreement. The Americans' initial demands, both sides would withdraw their troops. That is, American troops and troops from the North would withdraw in what the Americans called reciprocity, met defeat. The United States was forced to sign a peace agreement with the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. It was clear that the United States had no other alternative. We had achieved a momentous victory. The United States had to withdraw completely, while Vietnamese troops remained on Vietnamese land. I had a deep feeling of ferocity alongside an equally deep feeling of serenity, for I assumed that whatever must occur would occur. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The day of the Paris Agreement signing, January 27th, 1973, holds great historic significance for our nation. Each member of our delegation can never forget that day. All the world's newspapers placed this major event on their first pages. Across the world, people who loved peace and justice were in a festive mood, as if they were the victors. On the night of January 26th, no one in our 2 delegations could sleep. We were all preparing for the work we would do the next day. On the morning of January 27th, 1973, the Kleber conference room was bright with lights. Outside, thousands of people, our overseas Vietnamese compatriots, French friends, and friends from other countries, stood waiting amidst a forest of flags. I felt apprehensive as I walked into the conference room. At exactly 10 o'clock, 4 foreign ministers sat down at the table. We were the foreign ministers of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Nguyen Thi Binh Chapter, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam, Nguyen Thi Binh, the United States of America, William P. Rogers, and the Republic of Vietnam, Tran Van Lam. Each of us signed the 32 documents in the Paris Agreement. I felt deeply moved as I added my signature to the historic agreement. It was as if I represented the Southern revolutionary people and warriors who had accepted responsibility for struggling on the front lines and in the prisons to raise our flag in dazzling victory. I felt immeasurably honored. I do not have enough words to describe the endless gratitude I was feeling for our compatriots and our warriors from north to south. They had endured every courageous sacrifice in the struggle so that we could achieve victory that day. I was remembering Uncle Ho and feeling thankful to comrades from the party leadership, from the National Liberation Front, and from the Provisional Revolutionary Government. They had believed they could count on me for this difficult and honorable responsibility. I was feeling particularly grateful to our Vietnamese cousins in France and neighboring countries, as well as to our international friends, who gave their full hearts to our struggle. I was feeling indebted to the brothers and sisters in both our negotiating delegations and to our office and support personnel in Paris. And yes, as I signed those 32 documents, I was thinking about my family, about my husband and my children. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In truth, things did not flow perfectly after we signed the agreement. The United States still refused to accept defeat. As soon as the American Secretary of State affixed his signature, the United States embarked on its next scheme. We knew and expected this. Nevertheless, for us, the signed Paris Agreement was a great victory, a decisive step toward the ultimate victory that would return to us our reunited nation. The agreement reinforced and enhanced the PRG's prestige among other nations in the international community. A month later, on March 2nd, 1973, an international conference held at Kleber International Conference Center affirmed the legality of the Paris Agreement on Vietnam. The DRVN and American delegations organizing the international conference had argued about the venue. Should the conference be in Paris, New York, or Geneva? Who would attend? What would be the conference formalities? Some of those meetings ran until the wee hours of the morning. In the end, the two sides reached this consensus. The International Conference on Vietnam would have 12 participating government delegations led by their foreign ministers, with UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim as an invited guest. Among the 12 delegations, our side invited representatives of Hungary and Poland, while the United States invited Canada and Indonesia. The two sides, the United States and the DRVN, jointly invited China, France, the USSR, and the United Kingdom. A few days before the international conference, I received news that Mr. Kurt Waldheim, on his own initiative, was traveling to Paris to meet the DRVN and PRG delegations. He wanted to have an important role as an individual both at the International Conference on Vietnam and subsequently. Our comrades in the DRVN delegation let it be known that this issue was a decision for the PRG delegation. And so Mr. Waldheim came to meet me at our delegation's headquarters in Verrières-le-Buisson. During our discussion, Mr. Waldheim told me that the United Nations recognized the reality in Vietnam of three governments: the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of Vietnam. He suggested that afterwards, the DRVN and the PRG could perhaps request observer status like that of the Saigon administration at the United Nations. You want to know if the United Nations could perhaps assist Vietnam in rebuilding the country. We knew the Secretary General of the United Nations had sided with the United States during the American War in Vietnam. Surely, his intentions were not simple. Given that context, we could not possibly accept the United Nations as a member of the International Conference on Vietnam or agree to allow the UN Secretary General to serve as the meeting's chairperson. Yet to reassure the United Nations, our two delegations agreed to invite Mr. Waldheim as a special guest to the conference. When I spoke at the International Conference on Vietnam, I thanked the French government for hosting the four-party conference on Vietnam and, now, for hosting the International Conference on Vietnam. With that, I challenged the American puppet regime for not seriously implementing the ceasefire we had signed a month before and for pushing its forces to occupy our liberated areas. At that time, we had a great deal of information about the Saigon Army's plan to flood territory. Many delegations spoke in agreement. There was one short discussion about a suggestion from the Saigon administration's representative to include his speech as an official conference document, but everyone cast that idea aside. In the end, the 12 foreign ministers were unanimous in their agreement to sign the Act on the International Conference on Vietnam, which provided international affirmation of the Paris Agreement. A month before, immediately after signing the Paris Agreement, our PRG delegation sent Comrade Dang Van Thursday and Comrade Lumai to Saigon to join the PRG military delegation in the bilateral and quadrilateral joint military commissions at Tan Son Nhut Airport. This step was in direct accordance with a roadmap for implementing the agreement's military provisions. A week after signing the Paris Agreement, we joined the Paris Overseas Vietnamese community in greeting Tet, the year of the water buffalo, for our delegation's fifth and last Tet in France. It is impossible to describe everyone's joy and pleasure immediately after the International Conference on Vietnam. In accordance with Article 12 of the Paris Agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam, the two sides from the South agreed to meet to discuss and sign an agreement on the internal affairs of the South. Tran Van Lam, Foreign Minister of the Saigon administration, and I met to prepare for that consultative conference between the two sides. The first bilateral consultative meeting opened on March 19, 1974 at La Salle St. Cloud Palace southwest of Paris. Professor and Minister Nguyen Van Hu led the PRG delegation, while Deputy Prime Minister Nguyen Lu Vien led the Saigon administration's delegation. Those bilateral talks lasted until their dissolution in April 1974. At the same time, a fierce war continued between the Liberation Armed Forces and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. Bombs continued their death blows. Blood continued to flow. Initially, the enemy occupied quite a few of our liberated areas, but after a while, we were able to counterattack. We had anticipated the enemy's offensive strategy in Region 9. We retained our battlefield position and fought with valor. When I returned home from Paris and went to visit a number of localities and units, the comrades in the South would tease me. You comrades signed the peace agreement. We're delighted with the shreds. During those years in Paris, in addition to other tasks, in particular, Sister Nguyen Thi Chan and Brother Phan Nan, received directives to mobilize the overseas Vietnamese in surrounding countries and the people who had come from the South to visit France. Brothers and sisters belonging to organizations of patriotic overseas Vietnamese in Germany, Canada, Belgium, Italy, etc., met with the DRVN and PRG delegations to secure reports on the situation in their homeland and to help mobilize their friends. We place great importance on this work. These days, now, and then in my free time, I read my notebooks from that period when I kept brief notes on the activities of the NLFBRG negotiating delegation in Paris. Unfortunately, I cannot decipher some words written in my own shorthand and other words written in haste. Still, I am amazed at the enormous volume of work we accomplished during those years. Our delegation held regular meetings with comrades Lu Duc Tho and Xuan Thuy. When we would hear briefings about the military and political situation at home, as well as appraisals of the world situation, we would also hear new directives from our leaders at home. We were always having discussions between our two delegations about the direction of our specific struggle and the content of the presentations we would make at the negotiating table. We would try to predict our opponents' responses and formulate our responses in turn. Of course, we heard reports on our opponents' moves and accounts of public opinion in the media, particularly in the American and Western press. Then we would divide the tasks for joining various activities of solidarity with Vietnam in the wider community. We would attend international conferences, visit other countries, meet with foreign delegations, host Vietnamese overseas, plan our interviews with journalists from newspapers and television, and keep supportive international organizations informed. Looking back, I find it extraordinary how such a small group of highly motivated people working closely together managed to accomplish all these assigned tasks. I increasingly understand the importance of diplomatic action. Perhaps a wise diplomatic policy had assisted and expanded the battlefield's victories in a way that was most advantageous to our country. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I left Paris and returned home in early April 1973. The farewell gathering at Le Bourget Airport, the same airport where I had landed more than 4 years before, was an emotional occasion. Overseas Vietnamese, French friends, the French press, and representatives of countries with which we had close relationships arrived in great numbers. The UFF French women embraced me with emotion. "Ben, we'll miss you," they said. "From now on, we won't be able to see you standing there every Thursday in front of the journalists at the Kleber International Conference Center. We won't be able to call out, 'Madame.'" Ben smiled. Surely these friends also knew that I would miss France and my dear friends. I would miss so many people, in particular the French comrades, Pierre Toto Alain, and others who were our French security guards and drivers. The French Communist Party had assigned them to care for our delegation through all those years of negotiations. I would miss the overseas Vietnamese who did not spare their efforts and precious time to improve our situation. People like Uncle Tai, Uncle Kai, Sister Hong On, and Dr. Fan. The list could go on and on. On my way home, I stopped off in Moscow, where 3 of the Soviet Union's highest-placed comrades, Podgorny, Suslov, and Brezhnev, hosted me with great warmth. They conferred on me their Peace Medal, the Soviet Union's noblest accolade. Then I stopped over in China, where I was also received with great consideration. Prime Minister Zhou Enlai and other Chinese comrades convened a congratulatory banquet. At last, our delegation's greatest happiness was to return home to our compatriots and comrades. Comrades Le Duan, Pham Van Dong, and others congratulated us on the successful completion of our mission. Finally, I could return to my smallest and most intimate group. Once again, I could be with my husband and children amid feelings of indescribable joy. Total victory. The war raged on. Even though the 4 parties had signed the Paris Peace Agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. The National Liberation Front, NLF, of South Vietnam continued its work, but in a different way. I returned to Hanoi to continue my assignment as the PRG's foreign minister. Throughout the war, the South was the primary battlefield, while the North was a huge rearguard. Some years before, Hanoi had established CP-72 to manage and expand the foreign relations front for the NLF and particularly. To do this after we had established the Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG, of the Republic of South Vietnam. By the time I returned to Hanoi, the CP-72 office had 10 units with more than 200 officials and support staff. I was appointed to serve as the party general secretary for the staff. We had 3 comrades as the deputy, foreign ministers, Hong Bich Sun, Vo Dong Zhang, and Le Quang Jiang. These capable and efficient colleagues were also dear friends. The National Liberation Front was located at CUSVN Central Office in South Vietnam, our official headquarters at Loc Ninh. However, we continued to do the major part of our diplomatic work in the liberated area of Quang Tri Province at Cam Lo, which is 10 kilometers north of the Hien Luong Bridge over the Ben Hai River, the center of the former demilitarized zone dividing North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Thus, the headquarters of the PRG Foreign Ministry was only 10 kilometers as the birds fly from the enemy's military outposts. Were it not for the occasional, reverberating gunfire, no one would know that we were right there alongside the enemy. Our military brothers would remind us that we had nothing to fear. They pointed out that, since we were within the enemy's artillery range, the enemy was also within our range. We built our Ministry of Foreign Affairs on a 2-hectare piece of land. The building, which had been fashioned from painted plywood, had 3 rooms in the layout of a traditional Vietnamese house in the countryside. We used the middle room, the largest, for meeting visitors and receiving the diplomatic credentials of official guests. To the left of the ministry building was our hotel, where we had housing for guests. President of the PRG Government Advisory Council, Nguyen Thi, though, held official meetings at our foreign ministry in Cam Lo. He met representatives of the governments that came to present their credentials, as well as other important delegations. Among them, a delegation led by Comrade Fidel Castro and another led by Georges Marchais, General, Secretary of the French Communist Party. My colleagues and I in CP-72 were very busy with diplomatic work. Depending on the situation, we would issue statements exposing the American schemes designed to help the Saigon administration violate the Paris Agreement. We would use either the name of the National Liberation Front or the Provisional Revolutionary Government when we described the cruel effect of these schemes on our people. In addition, we sent delegations from our mass organizations to take part in international conferences, where we could mobilize other countries to support the Vietnamese people and demand that the United States strictly follow the Paris Agreement. We organized large receptions with performance troops on anniversaries, in particular on December 20th, the founding of the NLF, and on June 6th, the founding of the PRG. Our goal was to see that all who visited the liberated area of Quang Tri Province received a good impression of our country and people. Even though our officials and the local people were very poor, they were rich in personal warmth and delighted in hosting guests. My primary work was mobilizing other governments to grant the PRG formal diplomatic recognition. Before the Paris Agreement, the NLF-PRG had established diplomatic relations with many governments. By the end of 1973, 32 countries had formal diplomatic relations with the PRG. We were extremely active in our efforts to achieve diplomatic recognition of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. But we also concentrated on supporting recognition of governments recently established through their own people's struggle for independence. In January 1972, the government of the Republic of Bangladesh was formed under the leadership of the great Bangladeshi patriot, Premier Mujibur Rahman. In January 1973, our provisional government announced its diplomatic recognition and established formal diplomat relations with the Republic of Bangladesh. Simultaneously, the government of Bangladesh also recognized and established relations with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the Provisional Revolutionary Government. In June 1973, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of Vietnam opened an embassy in Dhaka. The people of Bangladesh were appreciative of our attitude. At Saigon's Tan Son Nhut Airport in an area called Camp David, the United Military Delegation of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam under the command of Lieutenant General Tran Van Tra, and after him, Huang An Tuan En Gaget, vigorously with our opponents for 2 full years, until the day of Saigon's liberation. Our brothers and sisters in the United Military Delegation at Camp David struggled endlessly to oppose the Saigon authorities' military violations of the Paris Agreement. With equal or even greater difficulty, our comrades, among them my friend Ngoc Dung, by now an army major in order to carry out our tasks, also had to struggle to their wits' end to secure the release of our captured soldiers and 200,000 political prisoners. In July 1973, the president of our Government Advisory Council, Nguyen Thi Binh, participated in the Non-Aligned Movement's IVTH Summit in Algiers. I joined the delegation along with several other ministers and deputy ministers. The summit formally accepted the PRG as an official member of the Non-Aligned Movement. Many leaders, including Cuban President Fidel Castro, Algerian President Boumediene, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, Cambodian King Norodom Sihanouk, and other heads of state, came to congratulate President Nguyen Thi Binh. Representatives from many other countries also expressed their pleasure in Vietnam's victory. They reiterated their demand that the Paris Agreement be strictly followed, and they affirmed their continued strong support for our struggle. After the Algiers conference, President Nguyen Thi Binh and I visited Senegal, Egypt, and Tanzania to thank our friends for their support during our struggle. President Binh received a sincere and warm welcome wherever he went. At that time, travel conditions for our delegation were particularly favorable because China had lent us a special airplane. During our visit to Tanzania, we experienced a minor but amusing faux pas. When we arrived at the airport, the Tanzanian military band had intended to welcome our delegation with our national anthem. However, by mistake, the band played Liu Hu Fuch's Youth Military March, which had become the Saigon administration's national anthem. Our friends were mortified and apologetic. Tanzania and Vietnam were so far in physical distance from each other that our friends did not know which nation used which national anthem. The next day, we visited Zanzibar, a small island off Tanzania. To rectify the earlier situation, our friends organized a military parade. The band played Liberate South Vietnam with great fanfare. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In early 1974, a startling and major incident took place. On January 19th, China sent warships and aircraft to occupy the Hong Sa, Paracel Islands, which lie within the sovereign territory of Vietnam, and which at that time were under the jurisdiction of the Saigon administration. Fierce battles broke out. The forces were unequal, with the United States as a silent accomplice to the Chinese. In the end, the Chinese occupied the islands. On January 26, 1974, the PRG issued a three-point statement in which we affirmed Vietnam's national sovereignty over Hong Sa, asserting that any maritime territorial disputes must be solved through negotiations. We reaffirmed our position on February 14th. We agreed to discuss the issue with all concerned stakeholders. Here was the beginning of a complex dispute between China and Vietnam over sovereignty in the East Sea. The dispute continues even today. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In June 1974, I received an invitation to attend the Afro-Asian Conference in Cairo. While en route, I stopped off in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, to lobby for official diplomatic recognition of the PRG. Today, the entire world knows about the tragedies that have occurred in Afghanistan during recent years. But by 1974, very few delegations from Vietnam had visited Kabul. Afghanistan, a country in Central Asia, is located between Russia, Pakistan, and Iran. It has vast mountains, with even the capital situated on hilltops. Afghanistan had just become a republic under President Mohammed Daoud. The Afghan Foreign Ministry gave me and my two PRG comrades a warm welcome. We were delighted to find that our Afghan friends had closely followed the situation in Vietnam. They knew we had signed the Paris Agreement the previous year. I explained our wish to establish diplomatic relations with Afghanistan. Our discussions revealed no difficulties, but our friends explained that the Afghan National Assembly had to affirm formal diplomatic recognition. They were sure the National Assembly would make an affirmative decision. But nevertheless, this was a formality which they could not overlook. I entreated, emphasizing that we needed positive and timely support. Our friends were sympathetic, but unable to meet the delegation's request immediately. Nevertheless, I did leave with our friends' promise that they would work for an early decision. At the end of June 1974, the government of Afghanistan announced its official recognition of the PRG. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Around September 1974, Defense Minister Tran Nam Trung and I were members of a PRG delegation, headed by PRG President of Government Nguyen Thi Phat, on a visit to the Kingdom of Cambodia. Our CP-72 division also sent comrades Truong Tung, a journalist, Luong Swan Tam, a documentary filmmaker, and Dr. In Hung, who was responsible for our health. Even though traveling to the south was much easier than before because the United States was no longer bombing ceaselessly, the trip nevertheless took 12 days by military jeep. We drove at night and rested during the day. For me, traveling the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail was a historic and emotional event. I was so moved to see at the start of the trail a huge inscription carve a route through the Truong Sun Mountain Range to save our country. Indeed, building that system of tracks and roads had been a monumental achievement, requiring that engineers and laborers cut down mountains and fill in valleys. Only the extraordinary level of our people's patriotism could have achieved such a heroic feat. I have no idea how many forests, mountains, and streams we crossed during our 12 days and nights on the legendary trail. During that journey, I was most deeply impressed by the volunteer youth. Each unit had several hundred young women. After the terrible bombing attacks, these volunteer regiments repaired the dirt tracks filled in the bomb craters and removed bombing debris so that transport trucks and other military vehicles could keep moving. My heart went out to those roughly clad young women in their 20s. They chatted and laughed as they dug and hauled dirt, seemingly unaware of their great danger. Only later did I learn that most of these young women were middle-aged by the time they returned from the war. Many had no other skills to support themselves and were beyond marriageable age. Those brave anonymous young women made an extraordinary contribution to our country. Their plight is still heartrending. How many sacrifices like theirs went unnoticed during years of intense resistance and hardship? Indeed, until now, we have not fully recognized their contribution. We have left many of them deprived of deserved support and recognition. At times while on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, we would travel half a day without seeing anyone. We had 2 jeeps. Sometimes, the track was so rough we had to stop. I kept asking whether we'd lost our way. However, each day, we would eventually reach our destination, even on time. The comrades at each transit camp received us warmly. They would provide a drum of water for bathing and a meal of rice with meat from wild game and vegetables they had grown at the camp. At night, we would drink a cup of tonic made from elaliacia, a kind of Vietnamese ginseng, mixed with sugar. Weary, we would quickly fall into a delicious sleep. One night, we had to cross a river, but the enemy had destroyed the makeshift bridge, causing huge traffic jams on both banks. The military engineering corps arrived. Some troops worked underwater, while others carried materials, all of them working without a pause. I felt overwhelmed with affection for these warriors. They were so young. Without war, they would surely have been students, workers, or farmers studying or working in their ancestral villages. Near Dop, now a district adjacent to Loc Ninh, I met with a logistics unit at the front. I was amazed and delighted to see orchids blooming everywhere and to realize that, in the midst of such a fierce war, our soldiers took pleasure in growing flowers. Yet I will remember always that a number of the comrades I met at that time died the following year during the spring. 1975 campaign. The Kingdom of Cambodia was both a neighbor and a familial country. Our 2 peoples had cooperated in fighting French colonialism and then U.S. imperialism. Each nation had provided the other with valuable assistance and support. Even though Cambodia shares a border with Vietnam, the road leading to the offices of the Cambodian government was torturous. That leg of the trip took a day and a night through deserted rubber forests. Eventually, we reached a post crowded with Cambodian guards and were taken to a spacious guest house made of wood. Before leaving for Cambodia, we knew that our signing the Paris Agreement on Vietnam had raised questions among our Cambodian friends, who worried that the agreement would work against the Cambodian struggle. Our mission's purpose was to clarify issues in the relationship between our 2 countries. During the Paris negotiations, the United States had wanted to combine Cambodian questions with Vietnamese issues, but Vietnam was resolute in refusing. We held firm to our position that the Cambodian people must decide any issues regarding Cambodia. Our delegation traveling to Cambodia wanted to state clearly that we felt the Paris Agreement created favorable conditions for Cambodia. In truth, Vietnam made concrete contributions to Cambodia's liberation, which occurred on April 17, 1975, even before the liberation of South Vietnam on April 30, 1975. As soon as we set foot in Cambodia, we sensed we were receiving a rather cool reception, which made us feel uneasy. Later, I learned that Cambodian leaders had already begun to adopt a position opposing Vietnam. The tragic events that ensued after 1975 made this all too clear. Already, we were experiencing disturbing symptoms in our own countries. Southwest flank. After spending a short time in the central office of the South, CUSVN, in early 1975, I received urgent orders to return to the North for an overseas mission. This time, the journey back to the North was much quicker, although the Saigon administration's airplanes shot us twice. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was much busier, day and night. Armored vehicles and trucks carrying ammunition poured down the trail. Waves of army units followed one another. Young soldiers from northern provinces marched to the battlefield as if in a procession. Preparations were underway for the 1975 Spring Campaign, the final battle of the American War, which by then had lasted 21 years, counting from the division of our country in 1954. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The balance of forces on the battlefield rapidly tilted in our favor. On our side, the PRG stepped up its political forces inside the zones the Saigon administration temporarily occupied. We concentrated on the middle-class intelligentsia and religious groups, and even included those close to the Saigon administration in order to expand our nationwide solidarity and divide our opponents. After the Paris Agreement, many Saigon politicians, including a number of retired ministers of state, used the name Third Force for zealous activities. By appropriating that term, they sought to insert themselves into the nonpartisan third group defined by the Paris Agreement and thereby undermine the clause. The United States must withdraw all troops and set up a Council of National Reconciliation and Concord with three components. The military and political situation in the country was tilting in our favor. Reactionaries in the United States faced the Saigon Army's consecutive defeats on various fronts. They advocated sending American troops back to Vietnam to rescue the Saigon administration. We had to denounce these deceitful intentions and the Saigon administration's concomitant refusal to implement the Paris Agreement. The United States continued providing assistance, thereby prolonging the war. For us, mobilizing world opinion was crucial. I left the South and traveled the trail back out to Hanoi in February 1975. I immediately received an assignment along with 3 other comrades to visit European and African countries and explain our views. At that time, we could not know for sure the Nixon administration's scheme. I knew only that, in accordance with our leader's directive, I must update the loyal friends who had supported our struggle for so long. I needed to ask them to watch the situation carefully and speak out immediately if the Americans intervened. Through documents now open and particularly through Larry Behrman's No Peace, No Honor, we know that the Nixon administration intended to deploy B-52 bombers against the North to rescue the Saigon Army, which was disintegrating. However, the Nixon administration did not carry out its plan. Instead, the Watergate scandal threw the White House into turmoil. Even more important, the majority of Americans expressed their opposition through the representatives they had elected to the U.S. Congress. Many senators insisted the United States abandon the failed war, which the entire world condemned and which had been so costly in human and material losses. I arrived in France, where I met with a number of journalists. While in France, I contacted friends in the United States, Canada, Sweden, and other countries. Then I went on to Algeria, where I met with friends who were exuberant because our spring offensive had begun and our liberation army was advancing with irresistible, unconquerable force. Our friends said they had seen maps showing how our liberation army liberated a new province every day. Progress was so rapid our friends could not keep track. Our army launched the 1975 Spring Campaign by attacking Buon-Ma-Thuot. I knew the Politburo had set its goal of liberating South Vietnam within 2 years, 1975 and 1976. However, after the victory of Phuoc, long and particularly following the liberation of Buon-Ma-Thuot, the Politburo decided to seize its opportunity. In early 1975, the Politburo formally opened the general offensive to liberate the South. On the diplomatic front, the PRG continued achieving major victories. Other governments watching our Army's massive victories saw that our struggle would soon end in victory. They quickly announced diplomatic recognition of the PRG. By the time the North and South were reunited in July 1976, 65 countries had recognized the Provisional Revolutionary Government. As a result of our visit to Algeria in early 1975, we knew the Summit for the Organization of African Unity, OUA, was about to begin in Tanzania. We flew there and asked our friends if I might speak to the assembly and inform the membership about an important situation. However, the OUA statutes allowed only representatives of African countries to speak. In addition, speakers could address only issues about Africa. I entreated our friends in Tanzania, the host country. In the end, the conference organizers agreed to give me 15 minutes at the end of the conference once the members had completed their program. Lamai and I sat from 6 p.m. until 5 a.m. without eating or drinking, waiting to speak. When my turn came, my throat felt dry. I worried I could not utter a word, but we achieved our goal. We described the situation developing in Vietnam and called on the international community to prevent the United States from sending troops back to Vietnam. On April 15th, Hanoi cabled us to return immediately. We had no money to buy air tickets, and Tanzania did not have a Vietnamese embassy. We decided to ask for help from the Chinese embassy, which provided assistance at once. By the time I returned to Hanoi, we had liberated Da Nang. Our armed forces were advancing toward Saigon. I received orders to go to Da Nang, where Government Council President Nguyen Thi, though, and many other PRG officials had already gathered. During that period, the PRG issued important statements and received foreign delegations as well as journalists. Since our troops had just liberated Da Nang, people from Quang Tri, Thu Thien, and Quang Ngai provinces were converging on the city, but we established order within only a few days. Our new administrative system began to take effect. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. On the evening of April 29th, 1975, I was hosting American historians Gabriel and Joyce Calco when we heard Liberation Radio broadcast an appeal to the Saigon administration and the Saigon military to surrender. This deeply stirring news moved the American historians and me to tears. We held hands. The next day, on April 30th, what had to happen did finally, at long last, happen. Saigon was liberated. This news brought boundless joy. Radio stations and other international media announced this news. Saigon has collapsed. The Viet Cong are victorious. People across our country poured into the streets, embracing one another and weeping, but with tears of joy. The common endeavor and sacrifice of all our people had brought about the inevitable. So many people working overtly and covertly had contributed, from the armed forces to political forces, from the children who had directed us along local paths to our compatriots from all strata of society, from the heroes whose names are known, to the millions upon millions of heroes whose names we do not know. No one can say, your contribution was this, mine was that. At that moment, I thought of our large rear area in the socialist North. This was our rear guard, but also our vanguard. I remembered once when I had visited Palestinian friends in refugee camps, and when I'd met the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat. Everyone asked us where and how Vietnam had drawn its strength for struggle and victory. We answered, there are three factors. We have Ho Chi Minh, an outstanding Vietnamese leader, who gave his entire life in service to our struggle for independence and freedom. We have our people's intense, strong solidarity. And we have the North, the socialist half of our country, as our huge, stable rearguard. Our Palestinian friends compared our situation with theirs and saw that, unfortunately, they did not have our strong points. Vietnam's final victory, which had been achieved in the end with such speed, astounded and elated the world. As I understood the situation, even the Soviet Union and China, two of Vietnam's staunchest friends, were somewhat taken aback. China had persistently advised us to prolong guerrilla ambush attacks because the enemy was too powerful. The Soviet Union worried we were not strong enough to win and feared the war would spread. Complicating the world situation, the Vietnamese people's tenacity and heroism and our final victory enhanced the position of the socialist camp in the international arena. We were also proud that we had boosted the confidence and determination of people in other countries fighting against imperialism, particularly against U.S. imperialism, and struggling for peace, independence, and social progress. We can never forget that behind Vietnam's great victory stood the immense, invaluable, and essential contribution of the people in socialist countries, as well as the world's people who esteem peace and justice. Since we had been able to begin and conduct the war courageously and cleverly, we knew we could also conclude it properly.